All righty, thank you. We're back for our second lightning round here at the MSU Comics Forum 2021 virtual event. I'm happy to again thank these participants for their willingness to give a short, but I'm sure really engaging presentation about their work and practice. For this lightning round, I will do a brief sort of like introduction of people and their general topics. We'll complete their presentations, and then we'll have a brief Q&A session. And then we have a big break between this ending lightning round and our keynote event tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the lightning round today, and lightning round number 2 is, our first up is Chris Sanagan, whose talk is entitled Primary Sources, Inspiration for Storytelling. After him is Sean Carleton, Getting Graphics with Activist Histories. And then finally, Scott Chantler with Bick's, A Visual Rhythm. These are 3 presentations that we're really excited to have here at the MSU Comics Forum this year. And I'm gonna throw it over to them and say, take it away. So first up, Chris.
All right, thanks so much, Julian. I'll just bring my screen up here. Okay, and there we go. Let's just see if it, come on. There we are. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for having me. Sorry, I've got a couple of things here. I just want to, so thanks so much for having me. My name is Chris Sanagan, and I'm joining you today from Guelph, Ontario, Canada, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples. I'm the writer and co-creator of Group of 7 Comics, an action-adventure historical fiction series set in the First World War, featuring a mix of famous Canadians and fictional characters starring in secret tales of daring and danger. The title, Group of 7, is a direct reference to the famous group of Canadian landscape painters, and the comic books are filled with references to Canadian art, history, and pop culture, basically all the things I love and wanted to see in a comic book. Illustrated by my co-creator, Jason Lapidus, who actually spoke earlier today in the first lightning round. Our first graphic novel, Group of 7, A Most Secret Tale, which you can see here on the slide, was released in summer 2020, and more stories are set for release later this year. Let's move ahead. Sure why that's, anyway. So, stories inspired by the events and personalities in Canadian history. Where to begin? So what you're seeing on this slide is the envelope of John McCrae's military file, which has been digitized and made publicly available to download via Library and Archives Canada. John McCrae, who you may know as the author of the First World War poem In Flanders Fields, written in 1915 and recited at Remembrance Day ceremonies the world over to this day, is also the main character of Group of 7, A Most Secret Tale. McCrae's file is over 40 pages thick and is a complete record of his service in the war, from his enlistment to where he was stationed, which battles he participated in, notes from superiors, personal information, and how he died, which was from pneumonia in 1918. Now, primary sources such as McCrae's military file are a one-stop shop of the building blocks of storytelling. And by that, I'm referring to plot, setting, and characters. They are a treasure trove of the tiny yet critical details that inform how people felt, the lives they led, and critically, for a graphic format, what they and their surroundings look like. Absolutely invaluable for crafting story and specifically for writing historical fiction and using historical figures as characters in your story. Now, I want my readers to get a sense of what life was like at pivotal moments in Canadian history. So although set in 1917, the story weaves in and out of the 20th century and includes events such as Canada's involvement in the South African War and the Great Canadian Flag Debate. So my writing approach was thus: events of point A and B are known. What happens between point A and B is unknown, and that's where I'd write the story. So the goal would be to provide a sense of realism while leaning into the ridiculous. The story does feature secret laboratories and monsters after all, in an ultimate attempt to entertain and inform. Okay. So in addition to providing the inspiration for storytelling specifics, such as names, dates, events, locations, I found that primary sources are invaluable for a number of other reasons. So not only do they serve as clues to the past, but they're also often highly entertaining in their own right. At the time of their creation, there would have been little thought given to posterity or the fact that someone would be looking at these things 100 years later. Therefore, they're often filled with tantalizing details and infused with the raw emotion of their creators. So who needs to write fiction when you can walk into an archives, library, or museum, or visit online these days, and access these remarkable documents directly? So now what you're looking at here on this slide is a section of Francis Pega-Magabo's enlistment papers. Pega-Magabo features prominently in the book and is recognized as one of the most highly decorated indigenous soldiers of the First World War. His completed form is 2 pages and includes information like date of birth, religion, marital status, occupation, previous military experience, and perhaps most gruesomely, whether he had any distinguishing marks on his body. He identified a vaccination scar, because, you know, just in case someone needed to identify your body. Jason and I repurposed this information in the form of mock military personnel files found in the individual comic books, which became a true blend of the real and the imagined. Primary sources also helped immensely with illuminating the very real connections between the historical characters in Group of 7, which led to richer storytelling and, most importantly, establishing empathy with the characters. For example, 2 of the characters of the book, Lester B. Pearson, who was Canada's 14th Prime Minister, and Conn Smythe, who was the founder of the Toronto Maple Leafs Hockey Club, crossed paths numerous times post-war and, in fact, exchanged correspondence in the 1960s. In this case, it was during Canada's Great Flag Debate, which established the red and white maple leaf as the national flag. So long story short, Pearson was in favor for moving on from the red ensign, which had been in use informally as Canada's national flag since the 1870s, and Smythe was against. We were able to use that personal history and tension between the 2 men as a narrative device to reflect upon how they might have interacted as soldiers in the First World War. Go again, come on. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So, and finally, these resources are great for illuminating stories we don't know that do not find themselves part of the popular narrative of Canadian history, that have been suppressed or ignored due to racism, sexism, or just they didn't fit the preferred storyline of Canada's involvement in the First World War. The narrative of which has been overwhelmingly white and male. So on the left is a picture of the Canadian No. 2 Construction Battalion, also known as the Black Battalion, a segregated non-combatant unit, the first and only all-Black battalion in Canadian military history. And on the right, a photograph of women learning to shoot at a rifle range in Toronto around 1915, possibly members of the Women's Home Guard, which organized and drilled the objective of defending Toronto from potential invasion. These images challenge our understanding of what we know or what we think we know and are incredibly inspiring. I want to know the stories behind these images with an eye towards adding them to the Group of 7 comics universe in some capacity, and then use the comics to inform and spark conversation about these stories and why they've been left outside the mainstream. So that's it for my lightning round talk on primary sources, inspiration for storytelling. Thank you, MSU Comics Forum, for having me. And before I go, I would like to publicly thank Beth Lapensee, who, by the way, is part of the roundtable discussion on representation in comics tomorrow at 2:30. During the script writing phase of Group of 7, A Most Secret Tale, she provided trusted advice on the development of the character of Francis Pega-Magabo and suggested I reach out to his family for consultation. I did, and it led to the family reviewing the manuscript and providing story edits, which made their way into the final book. So thank you, Beth, and thanks again, MSU Comics Forum.
Thanks so much, Chris. Next up is Sean.
All right, thanks so much, Chris. I'm looking forward to the discussion already. It's really great to be a part of this panel and a part of the Comics Forum this year. And today, what I'm going to talk about very briefly in lightning fashion is about the history of activist comics. And I'm going to profile some of the recent Canadian titles in this field, some of which I've helped produce and plug my fellow colleagues as well. So my name is Sean Carleton. I'm a Canadian historian at the University of Manitoba here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm also an artist, a curator, a designer, a public history practitioner, as well as a member of the Graphic History Collective, a team of activists, writers, artists, and researchers committed to combining history, activism, and comics. So what I'm going to do with my brief time today is talk about the longer history of activist comics in a short way, and then profile some of the recent developments in the field. So let's get going. Now, most of the histories of comics ignore the medium's early activist adopters. For example, on the far left here, Ernest Ribb's Mr. Block, which was published by the Industrial Workers of the World in the 1910s in its union newspaper. This used sequential art to poke fun at the proverbial patriotic, law-abiding, anti-union blockhead, to great effect as an agitational and educational tool. There were also many standalone graphic books, many of them wordless lino cuts with openly left politics, published in the 1930s and 40s, including Prelude to a Million Years by Lynn Ward and Giacomo Patri's White Collar. As we know, much of the medium's critical edge was driven underground in the 1960s and 1970s, but reemerged in the birth of the graphic novel in the 80s and 90s, something especially evident in works by Alan Moore, yes, but also Spain Rodriguez and Sharon Rudolph's work, and the editing work of Paul Buell in the early 2000s. But much of this work was done by Americans. And inspired by this work, a few of us formed the Graphic History Collective in 2008 to combine activist history and comics in Canada. And so far, we've published 4 titles. Mayday, a graphic history of protest in 2012, which looks at the Canadian dimensions of International Workers' Day, or May Day, which is celebrated on May 1st around the world. And this book looks at the Canadian aspect of that. Drawn to Change, Graphic Histories of Working Class Struggle, which we published in 2016, is a diverse collection of labor history comics spanning 150 years. Direct Action Gets the Goods, which looks at the history of strikes in Canada broadly as a tool for social transformation. And 1919, a graphic history of the Winnipeg General Strike, one of Canada's most important strikes. But the GHC is not alone in the field of activist history comics. There are a number of really great titles out there that I want to quickly profile. Gord Hill, an Indigenous comics creator living on the West Coast, has published 3, the 500 Years of Resistance comic book, the Anti-Capitalist comic book, and more recently, the Antifa comic book. There are also others. This is just a very, very quick lightning sampling. We have Christy Pitts, which looks at working class organizing and anti-fascist organizing in Toronto in the 1930s. We have Rob Christofferson and Simon Orpana's Showdown, which looks at the working class history of Hamilton, and Cassandra Lychuk and Nicole Marie Burton's Enemy Alien, which looks at the crackdown of leftists in World War I, specifically the internment of Ukrainians. So these are just, again, in a lightning fashion, some of the work going on in the field of activist comics in Canada. And there are, of course, many more that I could talk about in the discussion. So in short, comics as a medium requires deep investment from its readers, connecting them to the magic of comics, yes, but also to the histories that they're engaging with. And that connection to the past in the present is a key goal of consciousness raising and making comics, I think, a great tool of activist history education. So these comics and the ones that I've profiled so far keep alive the dissident spirit in the medium of comics, which has been there from the start. And they also show that you don't need a cape and a pair of tights to change the world. And they also show that there is an appetite for learning about history and activism through comics. And I'd like to chat more about that today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Last but certainly not least, of course, is Scott. And then we'll throw it open for conversation and questions.
Wonderful. I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. I'm going to assume that's working unless somebody tells me otherwise.
It's working.
Okay, wonderful. That's so far so good. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Chantler. I would like to just, thank MSU for having me at this forum. I've been enjoying most of the discussions today. I think this kind of thing is great for comics, so very happy to be here. I'm a longtime comics creator of comic books and graphic novels, mostly graphic novels in the book market in the last 13, 14 years, really. I'm going to be talking about my most recent book, which is a graphic biography called Bicks, published last April 2020 by Gallery 13 Simon & Schuster. And it's got some interesting visual properties and a mix of form and content that I think this audience might find interesting. So let's dig in. The book is about Leon Bick Spiderbeck, who was an early jazz cornetist and pianist. He died tragically young. He was quite an alcoholic, drank himself to death at the age of 28. He was the first white musician to really contribute significantly to the development of jazz, which is an interesting, the 1920s being that decade where Black American culture sort of became mainstream American culture. And Bix was almost patient zero for that. So, in addition to really, being an interesting artist in his own right, he came along at a very interesting time in history and culture. Definitely an interesting character. When it came time to do the book, I read everything I could read about him. There are a small handful of books about Bix, all of which are out of print currently. So I had to do some searching around the internet to get my hands on these. Many of them contradict each other. They are all generally unliked by the Spiderbeck family and by a lot of Bix historians online. Generally, they're criticized for, the amount to which they may mythologize Bix to a certain extent. But I'm interested in that stuff too. I'm interested in the myths. Artists tend to mythologize themselves. Bix certainly did. My friend, Dr. Samantha Kutrara, who I know is in the chat, said this morning, no history is accurate. And her and I are in total agreement on that. Facts are facts, but truth often depends on where you're standing. So first job for me in doing a book like this is figuring out where everyone was standing. My own primary research involved, I hit the road. I visited Bix's childhood home in Davenport, Iowa. Also his grave. He's buried back home in Iowa, there at the bottom. I visited the private school he got kicked out of in Lake Forest, Illinois, in the top right there. And he was in an early rehab at this institute in Dwight, Illinois, in the bottom right. So I, went, did all the legwork in the places. I also visited the Davenport, just as I was starting the research for my book, very conveniently, a new Bick Spiderbeck museum opened in Davenport, Iowa. So I went there and was able to, dig through some primary research. They actually have one of his cornets on display, which was great, because have you ever tried to draw a cornet? It's not easy. Cornets and trumpets and stuff. My style is pretty simple and kind of cartoony, but things still need to look like things. And this is a very complicated thing. So I have a lot of reference photos of this cornet, I got to tell you. Very convenient of them to open this museum just as I was starting research for the book. But despite all the biographical stuff, what I wanted to do with my book was mostly a formal experiment. And the idea came to me when I was working on this book, Two Generals, which is the book I'm best known for here in Canada. I'm speaking to you today from Stratford, Ontario. I don't know how much it's known in the US, but it's in a lot of high schools and universities here at home, and is a perennial seller, which I'm thankful for. But when I was working on this, I'm very much into visual rhythms, and I'm very much into the musicality of stories. And this being a book about my grandfather's experiences in World War II, it's a military story. So I used this 9-panel grid, which creates a very sort of staccato, precise military rhythm to the reading experience. And while I was working on this, like I said, over a decade ago now, I began to think, what would the opposite of this be in terms of rhythm and timing? Which got me interested in doing a book about music, because music is a thing that creators often talk about, struggling to depict in a visual way in comics. I wanted something a little more sophisticated than just a horn with some musical notes coming out of it. And that led me to the idea of jazz, which led me to Bick Spiderbeck eventually. Something about Bick's life seemed, to have a kind of a universal resonance, especially where artists and other outsiders are concerned. So with Bick's, the way I interpreted that was that through most of the book, each page is a 5-panel strip, again, of evenly sized and spaced panels. And so when you have the book open, we're actually looking at a spread here. When you have the book open reading, it actually becomes a 10-panel comic strip, just a horizontal line of these, kind of staccato beats across the page. And, this, of course, represents the kind of mundane, monotonous pace of everyday life. This is, life back home in Iowa. Although it looks like Bick's is having a bit of fun here, but that's beside the point. This is the kind of regular, normal life sort of format for the story. When Bick's discovers classical music, which is represented in the story by the piano at a young age, the panels begin to bounce up and down like musical notes. They just start to move a little bit. When he discovers jazz, the panels begin to change size and shape, begin to overlap, bleed off the page a little bit, of course. And as his music evolves, so too do the page layouts evolve. So, this is, well, not quite the pinnacle here, but, his music is getting more sophisticated, and he's playing with Louis Armstrong, and yeah, you can see, we're quite a ways from that single line going across the middle of the spread. And sort of at the height of Bick's musical sophistication as a composer, he writes a piece called In a Mist that combines classical piano elements and, Black American jazz elements. And so at that point in the story, I lay those two page layouts over top of each other. And so it creates a sort of visual crescendo as the music crescendos and as his life crescendos. And then, of course, I mentioned Bick's story has a fairly tragic ending. So by the end of the story, we're back to this as he kind of decrescendos, and the music and the joy and all that good stuff in life kind of leaves the story, and we're forced back into this, confining visual structure by the end. And I don't know if that was 7 minutes or not, but that's about all I got. You can find out more about my work at scottchantler.com. There's a list of all my books there and stuff. And I'm taking a break from Facebook and Twitter for the time being, maybe forever. But you can find me on Instagram at scottchantler. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion with the other guys. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks everyone for coming in right around on time every time. I appreciate that. But that just means that we have a great opportunity to ask you some questions. And one question that I think probably comes up in all your work as creators, practitioners, you're making comics. Ironically, perhaps not ironically, it actually makes a lot of sense. I would argue that the work that you're creating really touches very, very strongly on some prime elements of comic studies, history, activism, culture. How much of some of that work might be informing what you're doing? So, for each of you, how much of the sort of previous work that might be attached to, say, historical graphic narratives, or works that are autobiographical, or works that are about activism, are driving how you're approaching the creation of your work? That's to anybody who wants to.
I'll start. My first, well, not my first book, but one of the first things I kind of wrote and drew myself as my career was getting going was a book called Northwest Passage for Oni Press. And that was published in 2004, 2005, the first volume, something like that. I've forgotten now. But at the time, it was, pitching anything historical was rare. I mean, you could get laughed out of somebody's office for pitching any kind of historical graphic novel much before that. Chester Brown, here in Canada at least, Chester Brown's Louis Riel, which I know Samantha Catrara was talking about this morning a little bit, which is a book neither of us particularly like, but definitely became a bestseller here and knocked some doors down in that respect. When I started doing historical graphic novels, it was only barely a thing. When it came time to do Two Generals a couple years later, I mean, some people try to compare it to Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and not in a good way, because it's about my grandfather. It's about a family member, but that wasn't a big inspiration for me, other than its specificity. I've really always admired how specific Mouse is, and I tried to do that with Two Generals as well. And of course, I learned a lot on Two Generals that I used on Bick's. But now, yeah, the floodgates are open in terms of historical material and comics. So there are a lot more things out there. I'm struggling to think of what other things regarding Bick's I might have been inspired by, but I don't know. Somebody else take over because I'm rambling. I'll think of more. I'll think of more while you guys talk. Or not.
I can talk. I can talk.
Yeah, do it. Get in there. Get in there, Chris.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, for me, from the idea generation for the genesis of Group of Seven comes from my work in I work in the heritage field in Ontario, and so we were planning work around the centenary of the First World War back now 7 years ago, and I was just thinking about all these things, and I was thinking about all these personalities that ended up who were soldiers as young men in the war, young soldiers who ended up leaving a really large imprint on 20th century Canadian history and sometimes international history. So the characters, I've mentioned a couple of them, but there's also folks like Frederick Banting, co-discovered insulin. There's a number of folks in there. And then when I started thinking about some way to figure out how it might be fun for these folks to go on an adventure, that's when I went to the historical record, or at least the primary sources in the archives, and found that they're all enlisted. They're all in Europe at one point in 1917. They're all physically there. So then that's the starting point. So okay, then that's the genesis of where the story comes from. And then as I mentioned, it includes, it's very much a traditional action adventure series with very much influenced by what you consider like an Indiana Jones approach to storytelling, to entertainment, but at the same time, to your question, Julian, about thinking of thinking back on approach, certainly from a historical perspective or other work that influenced it, I really do see it, or at least I really came up. I mean, I don't know if it comes off as this, but it's certainly part of my intention was that it would be a blend of traditional, let's say traditional mainstream comic books, which I love, as well as using subject matter and topic and narrative that references these multiple points in Canadian history, and then just really matching it up and seeing kind of what comes out of the mix. So there was no real, I didn't really attribute much of its development to critical pieces I either read, or I loved it all. I loved I love Mouse. I love Chantler's work. I love Spider-Man. I love whatever it happens to be. And I wanted to see that come out in some kind of mix, bake it, and see what it would look like, with the intention of an entertainment, as well as hopefully providing or illuminating, some of these stories, some of these characters, some of these personalities, not doing a deep dive, a deep deconstruction of these complex and fallible human beings, but perhaps at least presenting name recognition about who they might have been. And so then hopefully that creating a spark for conversation and understanding more about who they were and the circumstances of their lives.
Yeah, that thanks to Scott and Chris for their thoughts on that. From my perspective, in terms of the connections between activism and comics, a lot of the work in the Graphic History Collective that we've done has been to bring a kind of activist approach to the creation of comics. And I really enjoyed Scott your presentation, and I'm teaching a class on comics currently where we just talked about two generals. So I really appreciate hearing your thoughts. And
terrific, thanks for that.
And I think one thing that strikes me is that a lot of comics work is often done in isolation, or between one illustrator and one writer, or a team of writer, illustrator, and colorist. But a lot of the work that we do in the Graphic History Collective is like this weird, chaotic, many cooks in the kitchen, from each according to their ability to their need kind of approach, and bringing this sort of more activist grassroots. Everybody's involved in the researching, everybody's involved in the writing. Even if everybody's not involved in the illustrating, we're talking about design and layout. And we could have 15 people working on a 10-page comic, which is chaos, but it's also a lot of fun. And it means that a lot of different kinds of perspectives end up being represented on the final page. And so we've been cultivating this idea of solidarity, not just as something that we are representing and talking about, but also baking into the production of the projects that we're involved in. And I think that that's something that I'm seeing in other activist comics, people teaming as the collaboration is something that is a lot easier for people to do. And I think that goes back, one final point on those connections. At least in the field of activist history, graphic histories, Gord Hill is one of the more well-known names. And I actually met Gord before he published 500 Years of Resistance with Arsenal in the early 2000s. He was just showing up to demonstrations and Xeroxing his illustrations and giving them out to people in this more kind of activist, consciousness raising way. He wasn't trying to make money. He was really just using his art as a way of educating and inspiring people. And then subsequently, he then collected those pieces and then, started making, defined comic books. So I think there is a really clear connection between activism and the comics medium, as well as the way in which you can approach producing these comics in ways that brings the best of activism and grassroots organizing.
I really appreciate that answer. We have a question from Nicole Huff, who's a graduate student here at MSU, and she's asking, she's really interested in the concept of the archive and how all of you are in various ways engaging with the archive. And her question is, how do you find yourselves taking care of these archival artifacts? What is your process for assuring that you're treating these artifacts ethically and essentially doing them justice?
Oh, that's a really good question. With Bick's, I did all of my research with other people's archives at that museum. So with Two Generals, I also did a lot of digging around in the regimental archive and the Canadian War Museum and stuff when I first started to dip my toe into research. A lot of it, though, comes from my grandfather's own primary sources, his diary, his best friend's letters home. I've got just all kinds of stuff you know, paperwork about the invasion of Normandy. I've got just an unbelievable amount of stuff here from research from that book. And I mean, I take care of it as best I can. I'm not an archivist. My girlfriend actually is a PhD student who deals with you know, comics and some of this stuff also, and so she's kind of taken over a little bit in the last couple of years. You know, handling some of this material of mine and making sure that it is taken care of. But that's a good question, and I wish I had a better answer for you other than just I'm trying. But if my house burns down, we're in trouble. I've had offers from universities and stuff to archive a lot of this material of my grandfather's and of mine, and I'm sure I'll take one of them up on it one day. But it's hard to let go of some of that stuff, and you know, not just for sentimental reasons, but also because I may still want to do more with it. Recently, I revived my Two Generals research blog, which I gave up, you know, back a decade ago when the book first came out, because I didn't really have time and my kids were smaller and yada, yada, yada. But yeah, I've started to kind of go through the material again and post it online and tell people, here's what I've got and here's how it influenced the book. And people can check that out online if you want, to two-generals.com. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I've just left that stuff hanging around my apartment is that I still, you know, kind of wanted to do stuff with it. So my answer is I'm being as careful as I can while still making use of the research.
I'd argue that you know, I benefited from these sources. I didn't leave my house to access these archival sources. They've been digitized and they're made available online. They primarily start with those military files, which was a 5-year project by Library and Archives Canada to scan and all 600,000 military nurse files, anyone who participated from that perspective, including the records of the Newfoundland regiments, which at that point were part of the Dominion of Canada, which are now as province of Canada. So like that was absolutely invaluable. That was the source. So luckily, from an actual access to archival material perspective, I was able to leverage so many primary sources that have popped up through digitization technologies and efforts to make that stuff available through various archives and museums. I will talk though a little bit about how there is also, I think it's a question of like ethically about working with these materials. And there is some, we're working with real people. They led their lives, these are real folks. And so part of establishing, like from my perspective, in the First World War, it was 100 years ago. So there is a huge length of time between now and then. Nothing's too raw, nothing's too, I don't even think there's any participants anymore who are alive in the world. I think the last one passed away a few years ago. So there is a bit of distance that way, which I think gives a bit of comfort to taking a look at these things, because again, I'm taking these characters and putting them in silly situations, like literally storming a secret laboratory and fighting monsters. And I hope if you're that's great, check it out. But they're putting these in these extraordinary situations. They were already in an extraordinary situation, and we've kind of bleed into the ridiculous a bit. But still though, like, so I'm in Guelph, and that's John McCrae's hometown, and he's the main character of the book. And you can't swing anything in this town without hitting a reference to McCrae at any point. And so, I was cognizant of that as well. And so I reached out to the family, the descendants of McCrae, who were still local and still active in the area, just to give them a heads up. Like this, he's a character who's like schools are named after him. He belongs, like these characters belong to somewhat to popular history in terms of recognition, street names, school names, wings of museums, whatever it happens to be. So they're already out there in the public sphere. And so, but I still wanted to give that family the heads up this was happening, just because of the attention on anything McCrae from where I live. And so with the Pega Magabo piece, the advice came to reach out because I was, again, acutely aware of, Indigenous stories being written and told by people who look like me, and not really involving those members of those communities at all in the storytelling piece or anything about the creation of that. So it was important to me to figure out a way to try and reconcile that somehow. So I got some good advice about reaching out to some Indigenous comics creators. That's how I came up with Beth, who's presenting tomorrow. And she basically told me, she looked at the manuscript, said, you're coming at this very much like from a Western perspective of like how Indigenous people have been portrayed in like, say, Marvel comic books or something like that. I'm like, great, thank you for the advice, very much appreciated. And then she said, hey, look, the Pegama-Gabo family is still very prominent in the Anishinaabe community up by Parry Sound, Ontario, just northern Ontario. So it'd be a good idea to reach out to them. At the time, I got in touch with her, his granddaughter, just through Facebook. Talk about the social media being a tool for that specific piece. And I believe his grandson also wrote a book, a history book, I think through University of Manitoba Press, actually, on the life of Pegama-Gabo. So again, I was able to circulate a script. I was able to get some feedback. And then, again, just kind of to the point, ethically, just trying my best to incorporate their voice or the voice of his ancestors, or at least, anything like descendants, I should say, into the creation of that, so that the source could speak a little bit and could include that as part of the storytelling of the narrative.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I mean, one of the things that we've tried to do in the Graphic History Collective is take this, the disability rights maxim of nothing about us without us, fairly seriously, and using some of the platform that we have to create space in the comics medium to bring in other, writers, researchers, artists, and use some of what we can do to build people up. And the Drawn to Change collection that I talked about was a good example of us sort of making an open call for people who wanted to write about labor histories in different kinds of ways from different kinds of communities. And kind of working collectively so that people's stories could be written by those stories, and we could skill share to kind of like help create more space in this kind of community. And so I think that there, as you're saying, Chris, there's lots of things that can be done about that ethics of storytelling, research, and I think it's an important one. And just to speak to, I think it was it Nicole specifically who had the question about archives. I mean, I recently reread MetaMouse and some of Hilary Schute's work about comics as archives. That in many ways, the dropping of different information into boxes, is very similar to archiving. And I went down the rabbit hole, and some of Chris's presentation, I'm thinking of all of the different ways that the work we do in historical comics is archiving and curating and offering readers the opportunity as really the storytellers. They got to do the work to piece all of this together across the gutter. That the more care you can put in to your curation, the more people can get out of that. And then the last kind of thing, maybe to push us in a different direction, is also how do you ethically acknowledge that work? So one of the debates that we constantly have in the collective with our work is, okay, some of us are historians, some of us are comics artists, some of us kind of bleed. How do you use things like footnotes or graphic notes? And I think my criticisms of Louis Riel's Chester Brown, I mean, one of the good things that book did is create a conversation that comic books could have footnotes or notes. And I think that I've really noticed in the last 10 years, a lot of producers thinking different of creative ways to acknowledge the research work that goes in, and to talk about and acknowledge the archival work that informs all of our projects. So I'd be curious to hear Scott and Chris maybe think about the footnoting or the referencing of that archives process.
That's really interesting, and I think there's a question coming up that kind of touches on that a little bit. But I kind of took a pass on the ethical part of the question, which I kind of forgot. I kind of went with the handling, which I took as sort of physical handling, which is its own issue when you're dealing with historical stuff. But with Two Generals, it was one thing because it was my own grandfather. But with Bick's, it became a whole thing where this is another person who doesn't really have descendants, but his, family certainly has descendants. And, there were all kinds of opinions out there on the internet, I can assure you, about who Bix was or wasn't. And his life also touches on race and religion and a lot of things that people also have strong opinions about. And, untangling some of that, was really challenging. Like, to give you an example of what I was dealing with, the Bick Society, which is a collection of Bick Spiderbeck fans, their website doesn't say that Bix was an alcoholic. It says that he was too much of a gentleman to refuse a drink if someone was offering him one. So, like, this is sometimes what you're dealing with when it comes to history and characters that people have lionized to a certain extent or demonized to a certain extent. And as to how you do all that ethically, it's you just, like I said during my slides, you kind of read everything you can and inform yourself as best you can, and you have to make a judgment call at some point about what's right. You're depending on a lot of other people's, and their agendas that came before you, and trying to sort that out all is interesting, which is one of the reasons why with Two Generals, I've wanted to do this blog for so long that I'm now doing, is to let people know, here's the stuff in the books that is fact. Here is the stuff that is more of a kind of just a general truth from somebody's point of view. Here's the stuff I've completely invented to make this into a story that people are going to read. And, at some point, I might try to do the same with Bix. I had some contact with the family once when I started posting work in progress art from Bix on my social media. I got connected with James Spiderbeck, who was Bix's great nephew, I think. I think that's enough greats. And started talking to him with what I was doing, and he disagreed, in some places with what I was doing, and I kind of, explained why I was doing it. He, explained, well, our family, always said this, and that was, that was productive. I don't know if he exactly got the book he would have wanted, but he got the book that I explained to him in advance that he was going to get. So I was at least able to do that much.
Well, I think one of the questions from the chat, from the people watching, and Scott, you sort of answered this, but I want to ask it anyway, is like, how much do you want readers to go to the paratext, right? Like the material, like the foreword, the research blog, the biographies, versus taking the work itself, taking the comic on its own as a legitimate way to tell the story. Like, so from your perspective as a creator,
yeah,
where do you want people to be? And that,
I personally, like, just to put a button on what I was just saying, I want the books to stand on their own. But if there are people, and we're in an academic conference right now that's presumably full of scholarly types who want to dig around in endnotes and know what the research was, then for those people, there's going to be this other thing where they can roll up their sleeves and dig around in those kind of procedural details. But I definitely want the books themselves to stand alone for most readers.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sean there, or Scott. Sorry, Sean. Do you want to get in first? I think I saw.
Oh no, go for it.
Okay, just saying that, like, similar to Scott, we had a blog that basically had I love panel by panel annotations, because that's just what I love as a comics reader. And so I had a panel by panel, like, this is a reference to this, more information, go here. And I would try to find and hunt down reputable online sources that could then speak to where that information came from, right? So I tried my best, you're trying to get out there. But I would love for folks to, I want the story to stand on its own as this kind of full of, what it is, but I would also love people to learn more about the inspiration behind it. And what I found actually is that Now, when we used to have shows back in the day, physical shows, I mean, this is a great show, but we used to meet each other in person. I found that when people come to the table and we talk comics and we talk about Group of Seven, and we talk about where the ideas came from, that was the point where, you know, that people were interested where the sources, because I'd say things like, they're like, oh, well, this is clearly all made up. I'm like, well, yeah, parts of it are, but like the fact that they were all in Europe in 1917 in April, that's not made up. They're there. You know, yeah, sure, we put them on this Avengers-like mission to save the world, but they're there, you know, like, and so, and all those, like, you know, oh, this place doesn't exist. I'm like, no, that's what Canadian headquarters was called, and that's what this was, you know, and so there is I found those are the opportunities, those kind of in person. They really did kind of lend themselves well to maybe again providing or you're providing access to those points of entry into the inspiration. But again, just to what Scott was saying, like being, you know, we've been so open about it. We've been like, here are references, just because we kind of like that too. We want it to be open. We find that when we hear more about how creators created their work, whether it's the artist Jason in the book, like learning how, you know, whatever it happens to be, like how someone learned to sketch or color that Daredevil issue, whatever it is, like we're into that. And so I think providing the, like, you know, being as open as possible and providing those points of access where and when you can, you know, I mean, it's kind of like a combo. Hopefully you get the best of both worlds.
And you get different kind of readers too, right? Like you and me, Chris, I'm like you. I want to know how the trick was done. I'm a process junkie. You know, some people don't want to know how the trick was done, and that's fine too. So people can choose.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the idea of paratext, and in some ways, I'll come at this from a nerdy theoretical perspective, and then I'll make it practical. You know, one of the more interesting conversations coming out in comics debate right now for me is sort of Jonathan Flowers' response to Scott McCloud. I don't know if people have read his recent response, basically challenging McCloud's idea that we all start from the same spot when we open a comic book, and challenging the kind of like the white and often maleness of that starting point. And Flowers is sort of saying, actually, we need to be cognizant of the fact that people open the comic book from different perspectives. We don't all have the same starting points. And as creators, we need to think about that more carefully. And one of the things that I've learned in making these sort of like working class history comics is how little most working class people know about working class history. And that there actually is a lot that you need to do to get people to understand sort of some basic starting points. And we've come to see like the paratext as an essential part of the text to help ensure that the book can stand on its own. Otherwise, you know, people who have class illusions open it up and they don't see themselves represented. You have to do the heavy work of saying, if you work in a capitalist society, you are working class. You're not, doesn't matter how much you make in your class, you know, class is a relationship to production. And like all of those sorts of things are a stumbling blocks for a lot of people to identify with working class history. And so we've come to see some of the paratext as an actual, an essential kind of primer to help people dig into and engage with the work. And so I see, at least in the work that we're doing, it as an essential part of the text, not as something that exists separately. Or once the book ends and then you have the notes and the bibliography. No, for us, that's all, it's all part of the same conversation. It's maybe not represented graphically, although I'm starting to see people have like graphic notes and things like that, which are graphic introductions and prefaces and all of that, which I think is an interesting maybe way forward too.
So we have time for one more question, and there is a question in the chat that's asking, how do you get in the heads of historical characters? And part of the challenge I think that they're pointing to here is people in the past have different experiences, different sort of contexts. How do you make those people and relate to our contemporary moment, right? Like the challenge of historical context when you're trying to create a story for a contemporary reader. And then it's a question that has many possible answers, but for you as creators who are thinking about subject matter, I think you've alluded to the research that you do, some of the context around sort of creating a story world through various means. But for other creators out there, for practitioners, what's the process for you as creators to make that story world work?
For me, it's a matter of picking a subject or a character, I guess, that I already feel some connection to. I mean, the book about my grandfather obviously was a bit of a slam dunk because I knew my grandfather, albeit as an older man. But trying to imagine him in an earlier time going through this important historical event, was a little easier because of my experiences with the man himself. Obviously, with Bix, I don't have that connection. Bix died 40 years before I was born. But again, I chose, to as something to wrap around this formal experiment that I wanted to do with how to, depict music and also the kind of rhythm of life. I found a character who I could identify with despite the difference in historical era. I mean, when you boil it down, Bix was a middle-class white kid from a small town who wanted to get involved in an art form that was, somewhat alien to him at the time. And had to kind of fight his way out of that small town and the small town thinking and make a new name for himself in this art form. That's my story. That's me. I grew up in a small town in the 1970s, just south of here in Ontario. And nobody took my stuff seriously. I want to grow up and draw comics and all that stuff. So yeah, coming from an unlikely place and creating art in an unlikely medium, that's something I could connect to, wholeheartedly. And the rest is just details. You research the period and you try to figure out how that story fits in its period. But it's a pretty universal story, which is why I wanted to tell it to begin with. So that's how it works for me. What about you guys?
I think I take a lot of liberties with my characters in terms of the fantastical things that they encounter. However, again, it's very much. I spoke a little bit about it in my presentation about the research illuminating actual connections, and so part of the genesis again of doing this story was understanding that post-war, so many of these 7 characters had real life relationships with each other after the war throughout the 20th century. So, and there is documented evidence, whether it's correspondence, photographs, whatever it happens to be, about their relationships. Because, again, it's Frederick Banting, it's, Nobel Prize for Science, it's Prime Minister Lester Pearson, all these like big names who left lots of records that are at these archives or these libraries. So part of it was doing some research on just kind of who the person was. And for me, again, those connections, those real life connections, just kind of led themselves to, thinking like to developing narrative that kind of builds on those real life connections they had. So, for example, we have a scene in the 1950s in Montreal, 1952, and Conn Smythe, who is the head of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the owner at that point, walks into the Montreal Forum, the old Montreal Forum. His team, Leafs, are playing hockey tonight against the Montreal Canadiens. He walks into the wrong dressing room, and on the wall of the hockey dressing room in Montreal are the words from John McCrae's poem in Flanders Fields, which to this day are still on that hockey dressing room wall. And so that's real. That is not that him walking in, but those words are on that wall. So then we can say, we can connect his potential presence in that building to those words, then use that to flip back 40 years to how those two characters might have met, and imagine and play, definitely play, working within the archetypes and the tropes of the action adventure comics, very much, not thinking too hard about who they were as actual people, but using some of that critical information to build up the character, to kind of get inside the head, and again, really building hard on those kind of action movie type tropes of the teen adventure, to move the story forward. So someone is the lab rat, someone is the navigator, someone is the leader, someone's the tough guy, someone, really building on those and assigning those roles to those characters, which again, because of those real connections, I found incredibly serendipitous doing the research. And so I'm like, oh, well, the story is it's happening for me. I'm just kind of in the mode of writing it down over a year to try and get something that makes sense. Oh, you're on mute, Sean.
For us, I mean, a lot of the work that we do is telling the stories of people who don't necessarily leave records, or their records exist really only as a collective. The project that we did on the Winnipeg General Strike 1919 is maybe a good example of, the actual character is the strike itself. We sort of resisted the idea of having a central narrator or a central character or even a collection of characters. The character actually is the strike, and trying to understand what that strike was doing in the context of Winnipeg and afterwards was sort of what we were trying to grapple with. And in terms of trying to get into the strike's head, a lot of what Chris was saying in his lightning round was what we were trying to do is consult as much primary material that exists. Luckily, the strike committee wrote their own history in the days after the strike as part of the trial to defend some of the people who were arrested, and that became immensely helpful. As many photographs and primary sources that exist as well. For me, any film that exists as primary source becomes almost my first go-to, because I think of film and comics differently but similarly, and I want to see in some ways that if there's primary source material in the archive about film, even if it's short clips, I feel like it connects me to what I'm trying to do with the comic. I just have lots of different kinds of gaps and things that I'm doing in splicing. So for me, trying to get into the head of characters, especially when you're taking a more atypical approach to character development, is really to dig into what Chris was saying, that primary source research, and trying to get a sense of what kind of story you're trying to tell, which, comics practitioners do all the time. But I also exist as a professional historian, and I do that with my own history writing. So I think, that's what getting graphic with history looks like, is mixing those two approaches.
And that's a great place to end this session. This was a really great session. Thank you so much for participating and sharing your work with our audience. This is our last session before our artist keynote. Also very serendipitous to have practitioners talking right before we take our break, and then we'll be back with our keynote. But again, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for your insightful answers to all these questions.
Thank you. Yeah, great chat, guys.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thanks, all.
Yeah, really appreciate your work, Scott, Chris,
yeah.
Julie. Thanks for organizing. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much to the audience. Thanks so much for your comments in the stream and your questions. As I said, this is our last sort of session for today, but do come back at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our artist keynote for the 2021 MSU Comics Forum. That's Kevin Huizinga. We will be here tomorrow, of course, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next roundtable. But now we have a break. So if you can go outside, talk to a person, get off the screen, and join us back here at, again, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the artist keynote from Kevin Huizinga here at MSU Comics Forum. Thanks so much for a great first day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sam. Take care.